The sky above Velara Prime burned orange and red as enemy warships descended through the atmosphere like a swarm of angry insects. And Princess Alindra stood frozen on the command deck of her father's flagship. Watching everything she had ever known begin to die, she was tall and graceful, with skin the color of pale blue morning sky and silver hair that flowed down her back like liquid moonlight. And her violet eyes reflected the fires consuming her world below as tears rolled silently down her cheeks. The Kethra had come without warning and without mercy, their massive hive ships emerging from hyperspace in numbers that defied belief. And within hours, they had shattered the defensive fleet that protected the Velari homeworld. Her father, Emperor Tyvan, stood beside the holographic battle display with his generals, his normally calm face twisted with grief and rage as he watched red markers overwhelm the blue ones representing his forces. "We cannot hold them," General Morath said, his voice heavy with defeat. "They are too many and too savage, and our weapons barely scratch their armor." The Velari were an ancient people who had existed among the stars for 10,000 years, known throughout the galaxy for their wisdom and their diplomacy and their beautiful art. But they had never been warriors, and they had never faced an enemy like the Kethra. Kethra were insectoid monsters who traveled from system to system, consuming everything in their path, stripping planets of resources and enslaving or destroying any species they encountered. And they showed no mercy, because mercy was a concept their hive mind could not comprehend. "Father," Alindra said, stepping forward, "what do we do now?" Emperor Tyvan turned to look at his daughter, and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, something that looked like surrender and acceptance of death. "You must flee, my child," he said, reaching out to touch her face with gentle fingers. "The royal shuttle is prepared, and it will take you to the Orion sector where the humans have their territory." "I will not leave you," Alindra protested, grabbing his hand. "I will not abandon our people." "You are our people's future," her father replied, his voice firm despite the chaos erupting around them. "If you survive, then the Velari survive, and one day you may rebuild what we have lost." An explosion rocked the ship and alarms began screaming throughout the corridors as Kethra boarding pods slammed into the hull. And Alindra could hear the distant sounds of gunfire and screaming as the enemy poured into the vessel. "Go now," Emperor Tyvan commanded, pushing her toward the doorway where her personal guards waited. "Find the humans and tell them what has happened here. For they are young and fierce, and they may be the only species in this galaxy who can stand against the Kethra." Alindra wanted to argue, and wanted to stay, and wanted to fight beside her father. But she knew her duty, and she knew he was right. So she embraced him one final time and whispered that she loved him. "I love you too, my daughter," he said. And then he turned back to the battle display as his guards led him toward the armory to make his final stand. Alindra ran through corridors filled with smoke and fire and the bodies of her people, her guards forming a protective circle around her as they fought their way to the shuttle bay. And she tried not to look at the faces of the dead as she passed them. The royal shuttle was small but fast, designed for exactly this kind of emergency evacuation. And the pilot was already warming up the engines when Alindra burst through the airlock. "Get us out of here," she commanded as she strapped herself into a seat, and the pilot obeyed without hesitation, launching the shuttle into the chaos of the battle. Raging above Velara Prime, Alindra watched through the viewport as her father's flagship exploded in a brilliant flash of light. And she knew in that moment that he was gone forever, that her mother who had died when she was young, and her father who had raised her with such love, were both now memories and nothing more. The Petit shuttle weaved through debris and weapons fire, the pilot displaying incredible skill as he navigated toward the edge of the system where they could safely enter hyperspace. And Alindra clutched the armrests of her seat so hard her knuckles turned white as The stars stretched into lines, and the shuttle jumped to safety. Alindra reached up and touched the small pendant hanging around her neck. A simple bronze coin with strange symbols on it that she had carried for 20 years. She remembered the day she received it. Remembered a human boy with messy brown hair and bright green eyes who had pressed it into her hand and told her it was called a penny and that humans believed it. Brought good luck. His name was Benjamin, and he had been the son of a human diplomat stationed on the Valari trading outpost when she was just a child of 12. And for 2 wonderful years, they had been the best of friends. He had taught her human games and shown her pictures of Earth with its blue oceans and green forests. And she had taught him Valari poetry and shown him how to read the light patterns of distant stars when his father's assignment ended and Benjamin had to return to human space. They had exchanged gifts and made promises to never forget each other. And she had given him a Valari friendship crystal while he had given her his lucky penny. That was 20 years ago, and she had not seen him since. But she had never stopped wondering what had become of the kind human boy who made her laugh and who never treated her like a princess, but simply like a friend now. As her shuttle drifted through hyperspace toward human territory, Alindra wondered if Benjamin was still alive somewhere among the stars, wondered if he still remembered her, wondered if he still had the crystal she gave him. The shuttle systems began to fail on the second day, damaged by weapons fire during their escape. And by the third day, the life support was barely functioning, and the engines had gone. Completely dead, Alindra sat alone in the dark shuttle, her guards having sacrificed their own air supplies to give her more time. Their bodies now cold and still in the seats around her. And she knew that her time was running out. She recorded final messages to her people on a small data crystal, hoping that someone would find the shuttle and deliver her words. And she told them to never give up hope and to remember that the Valari had survived for 10,000 years and would survive this. As the air grew thin and the cold crept into her bones, Alindra held the penny tight in her hand and thought of Benjamin and the summer they spent together as children. And she smiled despite everything because those memories were warm and bright and worth holding on to at the end. She closed her eyes and waited for death to take her, wondering if Valari souls went to the same place as human souls, hoping that wherever she ended up she might see her friend again. But death did not come, because something else found her first, something that would change her life and the fate of the entire galaxy forever. Alindra heard the sound of metal grinding against metal and thought for a moment that the Kethra had found her, that her final moments would be spent in the jaws of the monsters who had destroyed her world. But then she heard voices speaking in a language she recognized, harsh consonants and flowing vowels that belonged to no Valari tongue. And she realized with a surge of hope that these were human voices. The airlock of her shuttle hissed open and bright lights flooded the cabin. And Alindra squinted against the glare as armored figures pushed through the doorway with weapons raised and movements sharp and precise. "We have survivors," a deep voice called out. And then strong hands were lifting her from her seat and carrying her through the airlock into a vessel that hummed with power and purpose. The humans moved with terrifying efficiency, checking her vital signs and wrapping thermal blankets around her shivering body and speaking into communication devices in quick bursts of military terminology she did not fully understand. She found herself in a medical bay surrounded by equipment far more utilitarian than anything on Valari ships. All hard edges and practical designs without any of the graceful curves her people preferred. And a human doctor with kind eyes and steady hands began treating her. "You are safe now," the doctor said, his accent strange but his words clear. "You are aboard the Resolute, a warship of the United Earth Coalition Navy, and we will take care of you." Alindra tried to speak, but her throat was too dry, so she simply nodded and let the humans work, marveling at how quickly and competently they moved as they stabilized her. Conditioned over the next several hours, she learned what had happened while she drifted helpless in space. And the news was both terrible and strangely hopeful at the same time. The Kethra had not only attacked the Valari, but had also struck human colonies along the border of their territory, destroying 3 worlds and killing millions of people in a matter of days. But unlike the Valari, the humans had not retreated or surrendered or accepted their fate with dignified resignation. And instead, they had done something that shocked the entire galaxy. They had declared total war against the Kethra Dominion and had mobilized their entire civilization for battle, pulling ships from every sector and drafting soldiers from every world and building weapons at a pace that defied comprehension. The humans, Alindra learned, were a young species who had only achieved faster than light travel 200 years ago. But in that short time, they had spread across dozens of star systems and built a military that rivaled empires. 10 times their age. They were not wise like the Valari or ancient like the Corvani or patient like the Thesan. But they possessed something that other species lacked. A fierce and terrible determination that refused to accept defeat under any circumstances. When a human told you they would fight to the last breath, they meant it literally. And the Kethra were about to discover what happened when you made enemies of a species that considered surrender to be worse than death. Alindra was moved to private quarters once she was strong enough to walk, and she spent her first day aboard the Resolute simply staring out the viewport at the stars and trying to process everything she had lost. Her father was dead, and her mother was long gone, and her homeworld was occupied by monsters. And she was the last surviving member of the Valari royal family. A princess without a kingdom or a people to rule, but she was alive. And as long as she was alive, there was hope. And she clung to that hope like a drowning person clings to a piece of driftwood in a stormy sea on her second day aboard the ship. Alindra began to explore, walking through corridors filled with human soldiers who nodded respectfully as she passed and offered directions when she seemed lost. The Resolute was not a beautiful ship by any measure. Its walls covered with exposed conduits and warning signs and the scars of previous battles. But there was something powerful about it. Something that spoke of strength and resilience. She found her way to the observation deck, a large room with wide viewports that looked out into the endless darkness of space. And she stood there for a long time, watching the stars drift slowly past. That was where she first saw him, the soldier who had led the rescue mission that saved her life. Standing alone by one of the viewports with his back to her, he was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the gray uniform of the coalition military with sergeant stripes on his sleeve. And she could see old scars on his hands, and the way he stood suggested years of combat experience. She had not seen his face during the rescue because he had been wearing a tactical helmet. But something about the way he held himself seemed familiar, like a melody she could almost remember, but not quite place. "Thank you," she said. And he turned to face her with an expression of polite surprise. "You saved my life. And I do not even know your name." He was handsome in the way humans measured such things, with a strong jaw and brown hair that was starting to gray at the temples and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth. "Sergeant Benjamin Cole." "Ma'am," he said, offering his hand in the human gesture of greeting. "I was just doing my job. But I am glad we reached you in time." Alindra felt her heart stop for a moment as his name registered in her mind, as she looked into those green eyes and saw something she had been looking for without knowing it. For 20 long years, Benjamin. He had said his name was Benjamin, and he had green eyes just like the boy she once knew. The boy who gave her a lucky penny and taught her to play human card games and promised to be her friend forever. But that was impossible, she told herself, because the galaxy was vast and the chances of meeting one specific human were astronomically small. And surely there were many humans named Benjamin with green eyes. "Your name," she said. her voice trembling slightly. "It is a common name among humans, yes?" "Common enough," he replied with a casual shrug. "Why do you ask?" "I knew a human named Benjamin once," she said, watching his face carefully for any sign of recognition. "A long time ago, when I was young. On a Velari trading station." The sergeant's expression changed then, shifting from polite interest to something deeper and more complex. And she saw his eyes widen slightly as he studied her face with new intensity. "A trading station?" he repeated slowly. And his hand moved unconsciously to his chest where something hung beneath his uniform on a chain around his neck. "I was stationed on a Velari trading station when I was a kid. Actually." Alindra's breath caught in her throat as she watched him reach beneath his collar and pull out a small object that glinted in the soft light of the observation. It was a Velari friendship crystal, pale blue and perfectly preserved. The exact crystal she had given to a human boy 20 years ago when she said goodbye and promised to remember him always. "My father was a diplomat," Benjamin Cole said, his voice barely above a whisper as understanding dawned on his face. "And I had a friend there, a Velari girl with silver hair and violet eyes. And we used to watch the stars together every night." Alindra reached up and pulled out the bronze penny from beneath her own clothing, holding it up so he could see it, and the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. "Hello, Benjamin," she said, and tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "It has been a very long time." They sat together in the observation deck for hours, talking and laughing and crying as they shared the stories of the 20 years that had passed since they said goodbye on that distant trading station. Benjamin told her about returning to Earth and growing up in a small town surrounded by forests and lakes, about joining the military academy when he turned 18 because he wanted to explore the stars the way his father had. He told her about the first Kethra raids that struck the outer colonies 5 years ago, about watching the news feeds as entire cities burned and millions of innocent people died screaming. His parents had been visiting one of those colonies when the attack came, and they never made it out. And that was when Benjamin Cole stopped being a young man who wanted adventure and became a soldier who wanted revenge. "I enlisted in the ground forces the day after their funeral," he said, his voice steady but his eyes dark with old pain. "And I have been fighting ever since, because someone has to stand between the monsters and the innocent." Alindra reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm and the strength in his grip. And she understood then why humans were so feared throughout the galaxy. They were not the strongest species or the smartest or the most advanced, but they possessed a capacity for righteous fury that no other race could match. And when you hurt the people they loved, they would hunt you across the stars until justice was done. "Tell me about your adventures," she said, wanting to hear about the man her childhood friend had become. "The crew speaks of you with such respect, and I want to know why." Benjamin seemed embarrassed by the question, shrugging his shoulders and looking away. But eventually, he began to share some of the missions he had completed and the battles he had survived. He told her about Kepler Station, where a Kethra assault force had tried to capture a civilian research facility, and how he held a narrow corridor with just 12 soldiers for 18 hours until reinforcements arrived when the relief force finally broke through. They found Benjamin standing over the bodies of 60 dead Kethra warriors, his armor shattered and his ammunition exhausted, fighting with nothing but a combat knife and pure stubborn refusal to die. He told her about the Battle of Nexus Prime, where he volunteered for a suicide mission to destroy a Kethra hive ship that was about to release a biological weapon on a human colony. He flew a damaged fighter directly into the ship's reactor core and somehow managed to eject at the last possible second, floating in space for 3 hours until a rescue shuttle found him among the debris. "The doctors said I should have died 17 times that day," he said with a small smile. But I told them I was too stubborn to die. And eventually, they stopped arguing with me. Alindra listened to these stories with wonder and horror and growing admiration, seeing in Benjamin's eyes the same kindness she remembered from their childhood. Now tempered by loss and hardened by war, he was still the same boy who had given her a lucky penny and taught her card games. But he had also become something else, something fierce and noble and completely human. Over the following days, they spent every spare moment together, walking through the ship's corridors and sharing meals in the mess hall and standing on the observation deck watching the stars. The crew of the Resolute noticed their princess and their sergeant spending so much time together, and rumors began to spread through the ship like wildfire. But neither of them cared what people whispered. They were reconnecting with something precious they had lost, rebuilding a friendship that had meant the world to both of them when they were young and alone and looking for someone who understood. Alandra learned that Benjamin kept the friendship crystal with him always, wearing it around his neck beneath his armor, and that he had looked at it every night before dangerous missions and thought of the Velari girl who had once been his best friend. I wondered what happened to you, he admitted one evening as they watched a distant nebula glow purple and gold against the darkness. I tried to find information about you when I was old enough to search the diplomatic records. But the Velari are private people, and there was nothing about a princess named Alindra. I wondered about you too, she replied, leaning against his shoulder in a gesture that felt natural despite the years apart. I used to look at Earth through telescopes and think about you walking on its surface, living your life without any idea that I still remembered you. The Resolute joined a larger coalition battle group 3 weeks after rescuing Alindra. Dozens of warships gathering for what the admirals called Operation Homecoming, the mission to liberate Valar Prime from Kethra occupation. Admiral Catherine Price, a stern woman with gray hair and sharp eyes who commanded the battle group, summoned Alindra to a briefing to discuss the strategic situation. The news was not good. She learned because the Kethra had fortified the Ember Corridor, the only hyperspace route that led to the Valar system, and breaking through would require a massive assault that would cost many human lives. We are committed to freeing your people, Admiral Price said, her voice firm and her gaze direct. The coalition does not abandon its allies, and the Velari were among the first species to welcome humanity into the galactic community. Alindra felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized what the humans were offering. An entire fleet willing to fight and die for a world that was not their own, simply because it was the right thing to do. I do not know how to thank you, she said. And Admiral Price smiled for the first time since the briefing began. Thank us by surviving, the Admiral replied, and by helping us build a galaxy where the Kethra can never threaten anyone again. That night, Benjamin found Alindra on the observation deck, staring at the assembled fleet with an expression of wonder and disbelief on her face. They are going to war for my people, she said as he stood beside her. Humans I have never met are going to die so the Velari they have never met can live free. Benjamin nodded, understanding what she was feeling because he had seen that same reaction from other species who allied with humanity. That shock at discovering humans would sacrifice everything for strangers. That is what we do, he said simply. We protect the people who cannot protect themselves, because we believe that every life has value and every civilization deserves a chance to survive. Alindra turned to look at him, at this man who had once been her childhood friend and who had grown into a hero worthy of legend, and she felt something shift in her heart. It was something deeper than friendship and stronger than gratitude. Something that had perhaps been waiting inside her for 20 years. And she knew in that moment that she did not want to lose him again. Benjamin, she said, reaching up to touch his face with trembling fingers. Whatever happens in the battle ahead, I want you to know that finding you again is the best thing that has happened to me since my world fell." He took her hand and pressed it against his cheek, and his green eyes were bright with emotions she had learned to recognize during their time together. "I feel the same way," he said. And then neither of them needed words anymore. The briefing room was packed with officers and soldiers when Admiral Price revealed the full plan for Operation Homecoming. And Alindra sat in the front row trying to understand the complex tactical displays that filled the holographic screens. The Ember Corridor was a narrow stretch of stable hyperspace, the only safe route through a region of gravitational anomalies that made normal faster than light travel impossible. And the Kethra had turned it into a fortress. They had positioned 3 massive command stations along the corridor, each one bristling with weapons and protected by energy shields that could withstand nuclear bombardment. And behind those stations waited a fleet of hive ships that outnumbered the coalition forces 2 to 1. "Our fleet cannot break through while those stations are operational," Admiral Price explained, pointing to the glowing markers on the display. "Their shield generators are too powerful for our weapons to penetrate from the outside." She paused, and Alindra noticed several officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, as if they already knew what was coming next. "We need ground teams to infiltrate the stations and destroy the shield generators from within," the Admiral continued. "Once the shields fall, our ships can destroy the stations and push through to Velara Prime." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd, and Alindra understood why when she looked at the tactical data showing the enemy troop strength on those stations. Each command station was garrisoned by thousands of Kethra warriors, and any ground team attempting to reach the shield generators would face overwhelming odds and almost certain death. "I need volunteers," Admiral Price said, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was asking. "Soldiers who understand the risks and are willing to accept them for the sake of this mission." Benjamin Cole stood up before anyone else could move, his face calm and determined as he addressed the Admiral. "My squad will take the primary station," he said, and his voice carried through the silent room like a thunderclap. "We have the most experience fighting Kethra in close quarters, and we know how to make every second count." Other soldiers began standing as well, volunteering for the secondary stations, and Alindra watched with a mixture of pride and terror as 200 human warriors stepped forward to accept what might be their final mission. The briefing ended, and the soldiers dispersed to prepare their equipment and write their last letters home. And Alindra caught Benjamin's arm before he could leave. "You cannot do this," she said, pulling him into a quiet corner away from the others. "You are throwing your life away on a mission that cannot possibly succeed." Benjamin looked at her with gentle eyes that held no fear, only acceptance and resolve, and she hated him in that moment for being so impossibly brave. "This is what I do," he said, echoing the words he had spoken before. "I stand between the monsters and the innocent. And your people are innocent. But what about me?" Alindra demanded, her composure cracking as tears began to fall. "What happens to me if you die on that station?" Benjamin reached up and wiped her tears away with calloused fingers. And then he pulled something from beneath his uniform and pressed it into her hands. It was the Valari friendship crystal she had given him 20 years ago, still beautiful and glowing with soft blue light. And she stared at it in confusion. "If I do not come back," he said, closing her fingers around the crystal, "I want you to have this, because it has kept me going through every battle and every nightmare. And I wanted to do the same for you." Alindra shook her head violently, trying to push the crystal back into his hands. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "You take it with you, and you bring it back to me when this is over, because I will not accept anything else." Benjamin smiled at her stubbornness, a smile that reminded her of the boy he used to be, and he leaned forward and kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness. "All right," he agreed, taking back the crystal and returning it to its place around his neck. "I will bring it back to you. I promise." They spent that final night together in Alindra's quarters. Not sleeping, but simply talking and holding each other and trying to memorize every detail of the others. Facey Alindra told him about her childhood in the palace, about the gardens where she used to play, and the tutors who taught her diplomacy and history, and the responsibilities of royalty. Benjamin told her about Earth, about swimming in lakes during summer and watching snowfall during winter, and the way the sky looked when the sun set over the mountains. Near his hometown, they talked about what they would do after the war, if there was an after, and they made plans that neither of them truly believed would come true, but that felt good to imagine anyway. "I want to show you Earth," Benjamin said, his arms wrapped around her as they watched the stars through her viewport. "I want to take you to all the places I loved as a kid, and I want to see them again through your eyes, and I want to show you Velara Prime when it is free," Alindra replied, leaning back against his chest. "I want you to walk in the crystal forests and see the light of our twin moons reflected in the mirror lakes." When the call came for all assault team members to report to the shuttle bay, Benjamin kissed her one final time and promised again that he would come back. Alindra stood on the observation deck and watched the assault shuttles launch toward the enemy positions. Tiny specks of light carrying 200 of the bravest warriors she had ever known. Battle began with the coalition fleet engaging the Kethra Armada, and Alindra watched through the viewport as massive ships exchanged fire in brilliant displays of destruction and death. She clutched the bronze penny around her neck and prayed to every deity she knew, human and Velari alike, begging them to protect the man she loved as he descended into hell. The communication channels crackled with reports from the ground teams, voices sharp with combat and chaos. And Alindra listened to every word, even though each update filled her with fresh terror. Benjamin's squad had breached the primary station and was fighting through the corridors toward the shield generator, taking casualties with every step, but refusing to stop or retreat. 40% casualties, someone reported. And Alindra's heart clenched in her chest. 60% casualties, came another update minutes later, and she felt like she could not breathe. "Sergeant Cole has reached the generator room with 17 soldiers remaining," a voice finally announced. And then the channel dissolved into the sounds of weapons fire and screaming. The minutes that followed were the longest of Alindra's life as she stood helpless on the observation deck, watching the battle rage and knowing that somewhere on that distant station, Benjamin was fighting for his life and for her people. Then the primary station's shields flickered and died, and a cheer went up from the crew of the Resolute as coalition warships unleashed everything they had on the now vulnerable target. The other stations fell soon after, their shield generators destroyed by the sacrifices of human soldiers who had given everything. And the path to Velara Prime was finally open, but Alindra did not celebrate, because she had not heard Benjamin's voice since the shields fell, and she did not know if he was alive or dead. She stood alone on the observation deck, clutching the penny in her hand, and waited for news that she was terrified to receive. The Resolute pushed through the debris of the destroyed stations and entered the Ember Corridor with the rest of the coalition fleet. But Alindra barely noticed the historic moment because her mind was focused entirely on one thing. Benjamin had not answered any communication attempts since the shield generator exploded, and the rescue teams sent to extract the survivors had not yet reported back. She paced the observation deck like a caged animal, refusing all offers of food or rest, her eyes fixed on the communication panel as if she could will it to deliver good news through sheer desperation. Admiral Price came to see her personally, the stern commander looking uncharacteristically gentle as she placed a hand on Alindra's shoulder. "The rescue teams have reached the station," she said, and Alindra held her breath. They found Sergeant Cole's squad, or what was left of them. Alindra felt her legs go weak, and she gripped the railing for support, preparing herself for the worst possible words. "He is alive," Admiral Price said quickly, seeing the terror on the princess's face. "Barely, but alive. And they are bringing him to the medical bay right now." Alindra ran through the corridors faster than she had ever run in her life, pushing past startled crew members and nearly colliding with bulkheads as she raced toward the medical section. She burst through the doors just as the medical team was transferring Benjamin from a stretcher to a surgical bed. And what she saw made her cry out in horror. He was covered in blood, his armor shattered in a dozen places, with burns and gashes covering almost every visible inch of his body. And he looked more dead than alive. The doctors worked frantically, connecting him to machines and injecting medications and sealing wounds that kept opening as fast as they could close them. He should not have survived, one doctor muttered to another, not realizing Alindra could hear. The amount of damage his body has taken would have killed anyone else 10 times over. But Benjamin Cole had never been like anyone else. And even now his heart kept beating with stubborn determination. Refusing to give up to fight, Alindra stood in the corner of the medical bay for hours, watching the doctors work and praying silently with every breath. And finally the chief surgeon turned to her with exhaustion in his eyes. "We have done everything we can," he said. "The rest is up to him." She sat beside his bed for 3 days, holding his hand and talking to him even though he could not respond, telling him about the liberation of Vylara Prime and the Kethra forces, retreating in the face of human fury. The coalition fleet had reached her homeworld and found the occupation forces weakened by the loss of their command stations. And the battle for Vylara Prime lasted only 2 days before the enemy fled into deep space. Her people were free, and refugee ships were already returning from the distant worlds where they had scattered. And the long work of rebuilding could finally begin. "You did it," Alindra whispered to Benjamin's unconscious form. "You saved my people, just like you promised, on the 4th day." His eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, confused and wandering. But then they found her face and something in them clicked into place. And he smiled weakly. "Told you I would come back," he said, his voice rough and barely audible. "I still have your crystal." Alindra laughed and cried at the same time, leaning down to press her forehead against his. And she told him he was the most stubborn and impossible and wonderful human she had ever known. The war continued for another year as coalition forces pushed the Kethra back across the galaxy, liberating world after world and demonstrating to the universe that humanity would never stop fighting for what was right. Benjamin recovered slowly, his body scarred and his reflexes not quite what they used to be. But he remained the same man he had always been, kind and brave and completely devoted to protecting others. He was promoted to captain and given command of his own company. And the soldiers who served under him considered it the highest honor because everyone knew the story of the Ember Corridor and the 17 survivors. Alindra returned to Vylara Prime as the head of the provisional government, working to rebuild her civilization and establish closer ties with the human coalition that had sacrificed so much to save her people. When the peace treaty was finally signed and the Kethra Dominion agreed to withdraw from all occupied territories, Alindra was invited to address the Galactic Council as a representative of the liberated world. She stood in the great chamber surrounded by delegates from 100 different species, and she spoke about humanity and what they had done during the darkest days of the war. "When my world burned," she said, her voice carrying through the vast space, "the humans came to us not as conquerors or opportunists, but as friends who believed that every life has value." She told them about the soldiers who volunteered for suicide missions and the ships that sacrificed themselves to protect evacuation convoys, and they medics who worked without sleep to save wounded allies. "Humanity is a young species by galactic standards," she continued, "but they possess something that many older civilizations have lost. a fire that refuses to be extinguished, and a belief that some things are worth dying for. She looked across the chamber at the human delegation, at Admiral Price and the other officers who had led the campaign, and at Benjamin Cole, who stood among them in his dress uniform. "They are the best of us," Alendra concluded, "and I am proud to call them our allies and our friends." After the ceremony, she found Benjamin waiting for her outside the council chamber, and they walked together through the gardens of the diplomatic complex. "That was quite a speech," he said, taking her hand as they strolled beneath alien trees that reminded her of the forests on Valara Prime. "I meant every word," she replied, leaning into him. "You humans are remarkable, and the galaxy is lucky to have you." They stopped beside a fountain that sparkled in the light of distant stars, and Benjamin turned to face her with an expression she had come to know well over the past year. "I've been thinking about those plans we made," he said. "About showing you Earth and seeing Valara Prime together." Alendra smiled, remembering that night before the battle when they had talked about the future as if it were actually possible. "I have been thinking about them too," she admitted, "and I have decided that I want to make them real." Benjamin reached up and pulled the friendship crystal from around his neck, holding it up so the light caught its blue glow. And then he took her hand and placed it in her palm. 20 years ago, you gave me this crystal as a promise that we would always be friends," he said. "And now I am giving it back to you as a promise that we will be together for the rest of our lives." Alendra looked at the crystal and then at the man who had been her childhood friend and had become the love of her life. And she knew that some promises were indeed unbreakable. "I accept," she said. And she kissed him there beside the fountain while the stars watched and the galaxy celebrated the beginning of a new era. The war had taken so much from both of them, parents and homes and innocence, but it had also given them something precious beyond measure. It had given them each other. And in a universe full of darkness and danger, that was worth more than all the stars in the sky. This is the end of their story and the beginning of their life together. A human soldier and an alien princess who found their way back to each other across 20 years and 1,000 light years. Some might call it fate or destiny or simply luck, but those who knew them best called it something else entirely. They called it love.